Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here today for what would say a really important session, a really outstanding session. Even if we are few people, I think it's a very special day today because we have with us Rishi Rajpopat. First of all, I would like to thank Siam Saran, the president of the ICCR, for making this possible. Its director, Kian Srivastav, thank you very much. And special thanks to Sudha Gopalakrishnan, which is the head of the Kriti-SAMHiTA project. I would like to say that this lecture is part of the lecture series titled Kriti-SAMHiTA, which is the plurality of Indian knowledge systems. It forms part of a project called Samhita, which in full form means South Asian Manuscript Histories and Textual Archive, which the Indian International Center started in 2020 with the support of the Ministry of External Affairs. Samhita's goal is to create a knowledge resource on manuscripts, which has been the line of Sudha working, from South Asia that are now housed in libraries and private collections outside India. This will be an online platform that the scholars all over the world will have access to. I would say that this is a really a very necessary job because all we Sanskritists and Indologists know that many treasures of Sanskrit literature and Sanskrit Shastra are laying in some private house, in a village, in the house of a poor Pandit, or I myself did a PhD on Sanskrit grammar and I had to go to Bangladesh to pick up the manuscripts for my thesis. So I think it's a wonderful project you are doing. But let's go now to our speaker, Rishi Rajpopat, which about 2 months ago, he jumped into world fame. And it's a little thing. He's really, has become a sensation. And along with him, the interest for Sanskrit grammar is being renewed all over the world. Rishi Rajpopat pursued his undergraduate degree in economics at St. Xavier's, Mumbai. He earned a master's in Oriental Studies with a focus on Panini's grammar at Oxford before going on to pursue his PhD in the same field at Cambridge. After completing his PhD in 2020, Rishi was Gonda Fellow at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And at present, he is the academic editor of the Hinduism section at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland. Just to give you a very brief taste, because I don't want to be too long, we have a lot of work to do, actually. I just will read you, excerpt from a news that appeared in the Economic Times on 14th December 2020, just to make you feel the scope and of what we are going to deal here today. And having the author explain this to all of us directly, I feel it's a privilege, a great privilege to make possible thanks to all of you. The Economic Times said in 14th December, and I start a quote, an Indian scholar has created history after achieving something that has not been attained in over 2,500 years. And that's a pretty long time, one would say. For centuries, numerous Sanskrit scholars have been grappling with a grammatical problem. However, now an Indian PhD student at the University of Cambridge has solved the puzzle that has been confounding scholars since the 5th century before Christ. Rishi Rajpopat, the research scholar, stunned the world after his thesis was published on Thursday. The young scholar has demystified a role taught by Panini, a Sanskrit grammarian from ancient India, in his thesis, In Panini We Trust, discovering the algorithm for rule conflict resolution in Aṣṭādhyāyī. I think this is enough, and I'd like to give you the floor and tell us more about this. Thank you very much.
Right. Let me first thank Naresh, who's not been able to make it, my colleague at Ashoka University. Sudhaji, of course, who doesn't need introduction. Ambassador Saran, Mr. Srivastava, and Oscar. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all these people I've named for making this possible. Um, Thank you, Oscar, for agreeing to do this at such short notice. And very importantly, thanks to Niharika. I don't know if she's she's really given a lot of her time and very good advice. So thank you, Niharika ji. Um, so let me introduce. I was just talking to Sudhaji, and I thought it would be a good idea to introduce some characters in our story before we jump into the story. Because what often happens is when I do 5-minute interviews, I start talking about characters which people don't quite know who they are. So I think it's a good idea to first talk about the characters and then jump into the plot, as it were. So Panini, of course, is the big man of our story, uh, who wrote the Aṣṭādhyāyī. Um, it's always difficult to put specific dates on names when we talk about ancient India, but we're going to stick to 500 BC for the purpose of our talk. And so, a couple of centuries after Panini wrote the Aṣṭādhyāyī, we have Katyayana, who wrote the Vartikas on Panini's Sutras. Sutras are rules. And then maybe around 150 or 200 years after Katyayana, we have the Mahabhashya of Patanjali. So Patanjali wrote the Mahabhashya, Mahan Bhashya, great commentary. Um, and we have access to Katyayana's Vartikas only through the Mahabhashya, which, as I said, is written by Patanjali. So in the time scale, we've got Panini 500 BC. Then we've got Katyayana, his Vartikas, say 300, 150 BC, let's say Patanjali. So Panini, Katyayana, and Patanjali, and we'll talk about the others if time permits. So Panini wrote these 4,000 rules, which we call 4,000 sutras, in his extraordinary treatise, which is the Aṣṭādhyāyī. Aṣṭādhyāya, 8 books. So Ashtanam Adhyayanam Samaharaha, a compilation of 8 books. Not a The name doesn't tell you how extraordinary the treatise is, but believe me, it is extraordinary. It's got about 4,000 rules. Now, one of the challenges that I face is in explaining what this is, because in English I have to say grammar, and then people ask me, is it like teach yourself Bengali, or is it teach yourself French? And I say no. Then they are like, what do you mean by grammar? So it's not the sort of book you purchase when you're learning a second language as an adult. It's anything but that. You dive into it knowing Sanskrit. That's the beauty of it. It is, I would say, the creative enterprise of a genius, of a very serious theoretical linguist who set out to achieve something extraordinary, which and that achievement remains unparalleled to this day, which is what makes this grammar extraordinary. So let's use an example from the English language, actually, uh, to see what's actually going on. So what Panini helps you do is, the goal is to help derive any word of the Sanskrit language as was spoken during his time and before, uh, in a grammatically correct manner. The idea is that his rules are supposed to together function like a machine, such that if you apply them, as he would like you to, you get the grammatically correct form at the end of the derivation. We're going to focus on words and not sentences today, but we can also go to sentences because the machine has a sophisticated infrastructure, a very flexible one for sentences as well. So let's say we want noun definition, as the British like to pronounce it. And when you want to derive definition, you start with the verbal root define, and then you add what the British would say is the suffix ation. So define plus ation gives you definition. But notice that if I just juxtapose those two in my speech and say defination, that's not the correct pronunciation. It's not defination. A couple of vowels are changed, and then you get definition. So imagine doing that for every word of Sanskrit, right? So it's basically lots of sound changes happening at multiple steps. But we go step by step. At each step, you apply one rule. That is the idea. Now, this is where the problem arises. Because as you can imagine, there are 4,000 rules, some more general in scope than others. And there will be rules, as there are, which will become simultaneously applicable at the same step of a Paninian derivation. So, derivation is the construction of this word, like definition, only in Sanskrit. So, what do you do when two or more for that matter, rules become simultaneously applicable? This is the question. Now, Panini has, fortunately or unfortunately, given us only one rule to tackle this problem. So there are different kinds of rules in Panini's infrastructure, and one type is meta rule. I'll tell you why I'm talking about meta rules, because 142, that one big rule in question, is a meta rule. Meta rules, as the name suggests, help you deal with the meta issues of the grammar. We call them paribhashas. So these are rules that help you not only apply rules, so rather interpret rules, but also apply them. Also see how they interact with each other, um, and they really help you receive these rules, which are operational rules, which help you actually construct the words in a consistent way. That is the goal of meta rules. They deal with the meta issues of the grammar. So this meta rule 142 is what we are talking about. Vipratishede param karyam. Now, what does this mean? And this is actually the big question. So I'll tell you what the tradition interprets one word of this rule to be. We're going to stick to param to start with, and then we'll go into the details. So the tradition says, the tradition has offered many meanings of param, but I'll tell you the meaning that they essentially ran with, as Oscar will agree. It is the rule that comes later in the serial order of rules. So there are 4,000 rules. Rule number n will be defeated by rule number n plus x, where x is any positive integer, if they are simultaneously applicable at a certain step of the derivation, right? But when does this meta rule become applicable? Only when the two rules are of equal strength. That is a concept we'll go to later. But the idea that param means that rule which comes later in the serial order of the Aṣṭādhyāyī is what I want you to focus on right now. Now, what happens though is, if you apply it to all cases of two rules being simultaneously applicable, or in the future I'll just say simultaneous applicability, or rule conflict, which is a more generic term, but I'll use rule conflict just for the purpose of this talk. If you apply it in all cases of rule conflict, you often get the wrong answer. And the tradition, surely enough, noticed this as well, which is precisely why it seems to me that they reduce the scope of this rule to only those conflicts that are of equal strength. But now remember, Panini has given you one rule where he does not introduce the concept of equal strength. And this is where my perspective comes in, because right from the time I started studying Panini's grammar, I asked every person I interacted with, including my teachers, I would say, but Panini is not telling us this. If this man had the patience to write these 4,000 rules, surely if he wanted to say equal strength, he would have said it, right? So I was always skeptical about this, and that really helped me a lot actually in my work. So you've got this concept of equal strength. Now you might think, okay, well, equal strength. Maybe there's an obvious way of defining it. What the tradition says is, which rule pairs are of equal strength, or which two rules are equally strong. All the tradition says, all those rules which are not unequally strong are equally strong. So now you are as I will talk about later, you are interfering with Panini's ontology of Vyakarana, of his own grammar, in a very serious way. Because you're introducing new categories, right? That's one, but you're also establishing new networks of relationships between existing and new categories, right? So you're essentially, as you will discover as we move forward, you are superimposing your own structure of running the grammar onto Panini's, all in the name of, oh, this is what Panini must have thought or intended. And in the tradition, we have this thing called Jnapaka. So these are hints that Panini left. But I thought Panini was a very direct man, so I don't think he left such cryptic hints. See, that's where the tradition and I disagree. So what are rules of unequal strength? Again, you might think, this might be obvious. Unfortunately, it's not. So the tradition gives you a list of pairs. So if one rule is Nitya and the other Anitya, then the Nitya is stronger. Antaranga and Bahiranga, Antaranga is stronger. And Niravakasha and Savakasha, Niravakasha is stronger, right? And once you've gone through all of that, if the situation is still unfortunate enough, then you go to this dreaded 142, which still might give you the wrong answer, funnily enough, in which case then you use another Vartika written by Katyayana, which says that this is a case of Purva Vipratisheda. So instead of the later rule winning, the previous rule wins, and that's the end of the story. Now, poor Katyayana, when he wrote this in 3300 BC, he must have written it as an observation. You know, like you write footnotes that this doesn't work here and here. But the later tradition started using it as a justification for what's going on. So we can't fault Katyayana for it. So as you can see, and so you remove all these Nitya, Anitya, Antaranga, Bahiranga, all these pairs, then you apply 142, and still if you get it wrong, then you say Purva Vipratisheda. There's another meaning of para, which Patanjali, the third guy in our story, discusses, which is Ishta. So anything that is desirable. So do as you like, free for all, right? So one of the questions that we should ask is which of these interpretations is the traditional interpretation? But when you look at Prakriya being taught, the way derivations are taught, it's the one that I talked about earlier. It's not this desirable route in quotes. They take that route when necessary, if required. Funnily enough, Katyayana, the second person in our story, has mentioned in his own Vartikas two meanings. The other meaning of para is the one that I actually found and later realized that Katyayana has mentioned in one of his Vartikas. So, and I was very happy to see that. Because what does that tell us? That Katyayana did have exposure to that second possible meaning. He was intellectually honest enough to include it in his work. He did not dismiss it and say, oh, of course, only one way is right. He included it in his work. And he did not go with it. That is a separate issue. He went with the wrong interpretation, which created a lot of problems. So, anyway, to summarize, you've got rules of equal strength being all those rules which are not of unequal strength, and what are rules of unequal strength, nitya, nitya, this and that. Some of these tools are also very peculiar actually. So, what is Niravakasha Savakasha? Niravakasha is that which does not have scope to apply anywhere else. Savakasha is that which has scope to apply anywhere somewhere else. The idea with Niravakasha is if something cannot apply anywhere else, then surely Panini has not written it for nothing, so it should apply here. But then how do you decide if it's not applicable anywhere else or if it is applicable anywhere? So you have to run through every other derivation, right? Just practically thinking about it. Then how do you decide Savakasha, Niravakasha over there? So actually how the tradition does it is they say, oh, Niravakasha is because the commentary says it's Niravakasha, you accept it. That is another problem because some of these tools are very difficult to actually use correctly because there are tens of meta rules describing how each of these tools should be interpreted. As time passes, as the centuries pass, it becomes a very complex and really difficult to navigate maze. And I think we owe it to Panini to 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 bring his grammar to the people of India and the world for that matter, the way he would have liked, right? Those 4,000 rules, and as I will talk about in the next couple of minutes, there is a way, as I found, to actually receive his grammar using just those 4,000 rules, without any of these extra devices of equal and unequal strength and so on and so forth. None of which he discusses in his grammar. So first is faithfulness to Panini. Are we being faithful to the source text? This is something that philologists, historians, anyone who has done anything with textual analysis asks. And this is something I was sure about right in the beginning, because if you have to find an answer to this problem, it has to be somewhere in Panini. So what happened is I might have mentioned this previously, but I spent about 9 months the first year of my PhD trying to figure this out, and I did not make much progress. And I had just finished my bachelor's in economics, so I was trying to use sets and functions and relations. And my supervisor was, he was like, "All this is too complex. You're only, you're only doing what you keep criticizing. You're complicating things. You're not really solving the problem." And I thought that was very, I mean, I thought that he was right. So I took a month-long break during which I did nothing to do with Panini. I was cooking, swimming, cycling around, meeting friends, meditating, praying. Because I really, that there comes a time, when you sometimes you ask God for little things here and there. I want this book and this laptop. There's other times when you ask for bigger things. You're like, save my PhD. And that is what I did. I used to pray every day, meditate, and I knew that these things really help you open up your mind. So after a month, begrudgingly, I went back. I was really loving that life. I said, not doing Panini every day is fun, because I used to go, and I was doing Persian back then. So I used to go and open my Persian books and learn something or read something. It was the Asian and Middle Eastern Studies Library is a lovely place. So you can get lost in some new book every day. And I used to do that during the work hours. So, but I had to go back, and I did. And actually, when I opened the first book, I started seeing the patterns. I flipped the pages because naturally I had practiced a lot of derivations, prakriyas as we call them, in that diary, in that notebook of mine. Uh, so I noticed that when in cases where two rules are applicable to two different items, so to keep it simple, one to the root and the other to the suffix. In that case, the rule applicable to the suffix or to the right hand side basically wins. And then the more I dug into it for the next couple of minutes, the more I realized that this is a very strong pattern. This you cannot ignore. And I always knew that I would have to read it back into Panini's rules somewhere in some way, because otherwise I would be doing essentially the same thing that everyone else has done. Um, so I and the only rule, as I said, that I could look at is 142. It did not take me too much time to realize that this para here can mean right hand side. And it took me a couple of days, though, funnily enough, to realize that this is not the only occasion where Panini uses the term para in the Aṣṭādhyāyī. So, one of the things that philologists do is they take a word and they see how it's been received or how it's been used, especially when you do Vedic studies. You look at how it's been used in so many other places in so many different ways, and then you have to break your head. No, Panini is a very simple man. Everywhere he uses the term para in a technical sense. So there are two ways in which you can, to keep it simple, there are two ways in which you can use a term in Panini's grammar. One as a base, like say for example, I'm creating a rule. Whenever you're using the verbs change, write, dance, sing, and go, do it in this way. So that's one way he uses para as an item of a lexicon, and the other way he uses it is in the technical sense to mean right hand side. And then I've given an entire list of rules in my thesis. There is not one exception, barring, of course, if you listen to the tradition 142, where he uses para as something else. He always uses para as right hand side. So, why on earth should we interpret para as anything else? So that's when I felt very confident that this pattern holds true and this helps us solve the problem. Um, but no, but remember, and I've not added this so far in the past when I've spoken to the media, so I think I should mention this. There are two possibilities. One is where both rules are applicable to two different items respectively, and the other possibility is where both rules are applicable to the same item. So, for example, the same vowel of the base or the root, or the same vowel or consonant of the suffix or the whole suffix, whatever the case may be. In that case, I argue, or when there is any quarrel between, for example, two meta rules or two rules which are giving us definitions of terms. In all those cases, I argue that the rule which is more specific constitutes the exception to the general rule, and so the exception wins. And this Panini does not teach at all. So I really had to wrap my head around this, because on the one hand, I'm arguing we should only do what Panini says, right? So then am I not guilty of doing the same thing I'm criticizing the tradition for doing? So what I realized is, though, that the sutra style of composition is not exclusive to Panini's grammar or to any one school of philosophy, even for that matter. Sutras have been written on all kinds of things, right? So if you look at the Mimamsa Sutras, right, or the Brahma Sutras, everywhere you find one pattern which is inherent to the sutra style, which is that the more specific rule constitutes the exception to the general rule. And this we do in daily life as well. So that's when I realized that this is acceptable, because Panini is teaching us uh, the grammar of Sanskrit or the formalism or his formalism of Sanskrit. He's not teaching us about the sutra style. So he does not need to mention this, which is how I was able to justify this, the other part of the solution, which I don't talk about in my interviews as much because that's not the most exciting thing to highlight. So yeah, the system works basically now without any external intervention, and that is why I think for the first time we can very responsibly call it a machine, because we've claimed in the past that it is a machine, right? But actually when you jump into it as a specialist, you realize it's not an honest claim to make, right? Much as I always wanted to make the claim. But you can't, because I mean, it's a big claim, isn't it? So I think now that we rely only on Parni's roots, we can. I also want to talk a little bit about the scientific method, because when you are at a modern university doing a PhD and you make such a big claim, the question is, how do we verify this? So of course there's the evidence that he uses para everywhere else in the same way, so it makes sense. Yes, the system works, so it makes sense. Yes, but when you do this kind of research, you want to find as many ways of verifying your results as humanly possible, right? But these are more technical, these are more immediate practical concerns. So do we get all the are we able to derive all the words in a grammatically correct way? Are we able to check if para is used everywhere else in the same way? All those are more technical concerns. But so in the 20th century, Karl Popper talks about falsifiability. So of course, one way to falsify is to say that your system's not working because it's giving us many incorrect answers, right? That's one way to falsify. But if you have to compare between two or three mechanisms, then how do you say which one is falsifiable, or which one is more falsifiable, or which one is not falsifiable at all, whatever the case may be? Because one of the responses I received to my work, quite naturally, I think it's an very intelligent question to ask. Isn't yours just another way of looking at it? Because there can be multiple ways of looking at it, and I said in principle there can be multiple ways of looking at things, and I am the biggest advocate of that. So was Katyayana, so was Patanjali. But is the traditional method a falsifiable one? Because what you do is every time you encounter a problem, you come up with very clever solutions, might I add, but solutions which are not part of the system. So you're piling onto things. I was giving a very, I think, an analogy that some of you might find interesting if you've done some coding. So imagine you're a software developer. You've been hired to build a website, and we're just going to talk about the homepage of the website. So it's got the president's face and his address, and contact details, and our departments, our events, that kind of thing. And your job is to make sure that events is spelled properly, and when you click on something, the correct drop down appears, the phone number is clickable, there's a hyperlink to the email, that kind of thing. What a homepage is supposed to do, and you've written a code for it. But then you realize that no, the when you're trying to click on the email thing, it takes you somewhere else. The spellings are messed up. You everything's in a mess. What do you do as a coder? You go back to the source code and you try to find the bug. So where is the bug? What is the bug? Which loop, which if loop and for loop, where have I made a mistake, right? The tradition did not do that, because unfortunately they did not have this lovely home page where they could check, if the spelling is right. They went ahead with their source code and they added a lot more code to it, right? And then you keep piling code on, and then you're not fixing bugs, not only in the original code, but also in the second piece of code you added on this date, and the third piece of code. And that keeps creating problems, right? And that is why already by Patanjali's time, I'm not surprised that the man had to say param ishtavachi iti parashabdaha, that para means ishta, desirable, because these were very intelligent scholars after all, and they realized that these problems exist. In fact, all the way up to the 17th 18th century, you see paribhasha texts, so meta rule literature. So meta rules that you write in addition to those that Panini has taught. And in one school of grammar, which is not Paninian, but there are multiple schools of grammar in ancient India, remember, Paninian one being the most prominent and the most commented upon. in one school of grammar, as many as 50% of all those meta rules written in meta rule literature deal with rule conflict. So that is how vexing a problem it had become. So some of the scholars I've spoken to tell me that this they never wanted to look at it computationally, or they never wanted to. They were happy with the solution. But no, that's an insult to the tradition, because they were not. And these were scholars who were really looking for answers. Right? Sure, they were thinking within a certain framework, which might not have helped them. But to argue that this was no problem at all and that everything was hunky dory is an insult to Nagesha, is an insult to Bhattoji Dikshit, is an insult to everyone that they claim to be trying to protect and somehow protect the honor of. But these are intelligent men trying to address this problem. So this is an old problem, and I think if we have to take home anything from all of this, I mean, we are all going to be relegated to the margins of history today or tomorrow. But hopefully, thanks to the tradition, let me add, what will remain is this fantastic grammar and the great extent to which we've understood it. So far, before I wrote my thesis, before I started studying Panini, if it had not been for the tradition, I would simply not have been able to work on it. It's really not possible. There's so much the tradition teaches us, which is so valuable. So this is not me versus the tradition, right? Uh, yes, when it comes to the functioning of the grammar, I think the tradition has had healthy disagreements within itself. You got as late as in the early modern period, you got scholars having very heated arguments with each other. So if anything, I'm only one more person in the tradition, if the tradition accepts me as an insider, who is saying, let's look at this again, let's disagree with each other, because this is how you move science forward, and I'm pretty sure that if Katyayana was broad-minded enough to include two possible interpretations, even if only in some small Vartika, which did not get as much attention, that now and in the future these ideas will be taken seriously, and we'll start thinking about how to use falsifiable methods to receive Pani's grammar, but also to teach it to the computer. Um, when it comes to philosophy of disciplines, this is what I've been thinking about recently, because I was asked to write something about the history of the tradition. One of the things that I've ended up doing is I've ended up doing two things, I think, essentially. One is the epistemological question. So, what should constitute the epistemological foundation of any inquiry into Panini's grammar? And by that I mean, whenever we want to verify something, or whenever we want to justify a certain step we take in a Paninian derivation, should we use Panini sutras alone? Um, or should we also use Vartikas and the Bhashya and so on and so forth? And it's not as though I'm the first person asking this question, don't get me wrong, but this is a question that I asked myself a lot, and I'm very grateful to this question, because it is this question that really helped me look at things differently. And the other thing is the ontology of a discipline, as I like to call it. Can you introduce new categories into a system that you may not fully understand yet? And what is the cost that you incur of introducing these new categories? Because it's not just the introduction of categories, it's also rewiring the system. So there are 10 categories, and they all are related with each other in complex ways. If you introduce two more, then how are they going to be related to the rest? And how are the original 10 going to be related to each other as a result of those new introductions? So, um, and I've always thought about the philosophy of linguistics also, for example, where these questions are relevant. I think these are relevant for all of us, irrespective of what we do. So this is the note on which I would like to conclude my initial remarks. I think I'll add one more thing though, which is slightly provocative but very interesting. If Panini did not include all the things that the tradition has added, such as unequal strength and this and that, but more importantly, if Panini used param to mean one thing everywhere else, and here he meant something else when he said param, then are you saying that Panini was inconsistent, unreliable, using words loosely, right? If you're not, then are you at least willing to admit that Katyayana may have been wrong about one thing? He was a human being after all, as we all are, right? But we have to be intellectually honest, and we have to be willing to make a choice between these two. And by making a choice, we are not saying that either of them was stupid or bad or unworthy of our respect. We are only following, in the footsteps of a great tradition started by Panini and carried forward brilliantly by Katyayana, Patanjali, so on. So let's not make this about honor and respect. Let's let the Khap Panchayats worry about that, right? Let's celebrate our intellectual legacy, our intellectual heritage, of which we must be so proud. And and let's just continue this pursuit of truth, as our ancestors have done. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we will open the floor for questions. We'll invite, please. Please, just.
Yeah, so my question is pretty simple. I mean, I'm not going to say that, of course, what you've accomplished is great, it's huge. But there's a huge section of society that also says that Sanskrit is a dead language, that it is not relevant to modern times. So, how do you think your research brings that focus back to Sanskrit? And why do you think it is relevant to today's time?
So I think there are very many good scholars who are trying to do exactly what you said, which is see, I'm not going to comment on whether Sanskrit is dead or not. I'm not going to get into that rhetoric.
Yeah.
But I think we can agree that we want Sanskrit to be studied, and we also want to answer the question, which is quite often correctly asked: why should we study it?
Yeah.
I'll give you the more obvious answer first, which is that all a lot of our secular and sacred literature from the ancient and medieval period, coming all the way into the modern period, actually, is in Sanskrit. If you think about the Indo-Aryan languages, daughters of Sanskrit, the Dravidian languages have enriched and been enriched by Sanskrit and its daughters. And in fact, this is true of the languages of South and Southeast Asia, broadly speaking. Um, Sanskrit is also an Indo-European language, and it's really fascinating, actually, when you start studying the other ancient Indo-European languages, how these are related. So there's every reason to study it if we want to investigate our past. In doing which, I think Indians are becoming increasingly interested, and I'm really happy to see that. But studying classical languages in general for any student anywhere in the world, I think, is a very interesting exercise, especially among people who speak modern Indo-European languages. So, be it French or Nepali or Bangla or Gujarati, because that's a different that they because Old Indo-European has a different structure, and that helps you think about the structure of language in a different way. That helps you deal with grammar in a very interesting way. So that's another reason why. But I do believe that there are many mysteries of this nature which need solving, and I think who better than Indians to solve them. So I think certainly Indians must study Sanskrit. But it's really overwhelming when you see people. I mean, let's take Oscar's example. I mean, he's produced entire dictionaries: Sanskrit Catalan, Sanskrit Spanish. So, I mean, it's not just about Indians, I think. It's about everyone who is interested. Everyone should be welcomed and everyone should be encouraged.
I may also add something to the question. I mean, I think you asked if Sanskrit is still relevant for modern times. I just can say a big yes, okay? And without, I mean, there are many things, there are many papers written about what Sanskrit can contribute, but to give you a brief, of course, grammar is the first thing. First thing you should understand is that Western linguistics would have never appeared without the influence of Sanskrit scholars. The Western scholars didn't know the difference, didn't know a single thing about phonetics, for instance, which is not Panini and is before Panini. The difference between a sounding letter and a non-sounding sound. So all the phonetics that now Western linguistics is using, and terms like labial, terms like nasal, dental, which the Westerners only adopted by the end of in the 19th century, were new in the Pratishakyas before Christ, And this occlusive, the term occlusive, which means a consonant, which these terms are almost 3,000 years old. And Europe only knew this in the 19th century when Western grammarians came here. So that's one point. There would be no phonetics, no modern linguistics without the fertilization of Sanskrit. We could go in many. What to say about mindfulness, which is being sold all over the world? It's a Sanskrit concept, Sanskrit and Pali. In a broader light. What about aesthetics and the rasa theory we just built? What about the implications of Navya Nyaya, means the new logic? And what about the study of mind from the point of view, what I would say about yoga, which has become, so all these things, I still believe, and sorry, I will stop. I
No,
don't
no,
want to
please,
take
please, go on, go on.
I still believe, that as Rishi has said, there are many things to uncover from the Sanskrit commentaries that can be relevant to the social science. The problem, it's always the same, that the people who really know the Sanskrit commentaries, sometimes they are pandits which are not interested in the Western discourse. And again, the Westerners or the people, who are not from the tradition, sometimes their knowledge of Sanskrit commentaries is fragmented. So to bring all this together, it's a very difficult task because you need people who know very good the Sanskrit commentaries and they can read them without translation. And there are commentaries which are very difficult. There are commentaries that no one can read in India today. I was told that when I was studying in Banaras, because those savants have disappeared. So what I mean to say is that to take the gems out of Sanskrit literature, it's a difficult thing. But there are many fields. I stop here because I don't want. But
Yeah.
there are many points where Sanskrit is still relevant for modern times. It's my opinion.
I'll just like to add one more thing. Just yesterday, a book was discussed. The book title is Science in Sanskrit Scriptures. It has been authored by one Dr. Yash Gupta. He is a very famous rhinoplastic surgeon of UK. He is AIMS alumnus. He has been there in UK for last 4 decades. If you read that book, you'll find very fascinating things with regard to physics, with regard to mathematics, etc. So if you really want to know science, Sanskrit you must read.
Just to talk about what about Sanskrit and its relevance and its beauty to this audience. For you mentioned Sutra, you mentioned Vartika, the commentary and the source text, and which is very, very pithy and small, the Sutra, and how each discipline extends that according to the viewpoint that the author takes or according to the philosophical placing that that person has and how he or she extends that knowledge. And to that extent, I think a commentary is a very, very important text that needs to be studied closely. And it's not just one commentary. A sutra leads to different multiple commentaries of multiple points of view. So the whole thing becomes such a big network of knowledge. So it is not just limited to one, but it becomes a whole universe of knowledge in each discipline. So that is how Sanskrit textual tradition is built. So much about that, but we want to come back to Rishi's lecture. Uh, you were also talking about Katyayana and also Patanjali, how they interpreted and extended the knowledge. And you briefly mentioned Nagesha and Bhattoji Dikshita. I mean, is there, yeah. So has there been a line of dissent with them? How did they extend their knowledge? And what was their position in all this, in interpreting Panini, if you can say it very briefly?
I think we'll stick to Bhattoji Dikshita because he's a very good example. So actually, one of Bhattoji Dikshita's predecessors gave us the what is the Kaumudi, which Bhattoji's work popularized and really shaped into what it is today. And in fact, I was introduced to Panini's grammar through a subsection of the Kaumudi's rules. So Bhattoji said, why don't we reorder the rules of the Aṣṭādhyāyī when we teach them in such a way that we study, for example, devaha, which is the nominative singular, or the subject, when you make, in simple terms, subject of an active sentence. Why don't we introduce rules in such a way that only those that are needed first to derive the term devaha are taught, and then for the accusative, so devam, singular, and so on and so forth. Why don't we do that? So that was a very major epistemic rupture. Because here is a man who's arguing for a completely different pedagogical approach, and that approach also had severe implications, because while on the one hand it made the prakriya, or the style of deriving, or the method of deriving, much more accessible and easy to navigate, it also meant that students were internalizing certain pathways of navigating derivations, which by virtue of repetition became so internalized sometimes that, I mean, even when because I also studied prakriya like that to start with. So it sometimes I really had to think, where it was where later I realized it's so obvious that there is a conflict. I really had to think, is there a conflict here at all? Because you get so used to deriving forms in certain ways. So I think that's a very good example of how he sort of changed the way we do Panini. More in terms of the pedagogy of it, but it had severe implications for how we research the subject. And on the other hand, one can also praise him, because after all, the interest in issues of conflict also grew because of that. Because it's not as though he ignores those issues; he talks about them extensively as the author of the Kaumudi. So I hope that's answered your question.
Next question.
Sure, works. I was interested really in the main subject of your talk, which is your interpretation of Param. And I thought you went rather quickly over your solution. Now, you talked about the root and the suffix, but can you give us some more examples, and can you, really show us how your interpretation solves a large number of, I mean, you say there are no exceptions at all. At the moment,
No, I have.
we can only apply the falsifiability principle to that, but that's for scholars to do. I don't pretend to be one. Would you say something more about your interpretation of Param?
Sure.
The heart of your work. Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Let me also say, there are exceptions, and I discuss it in my thesis. But what I do is I explain that. In fact, this is also, I think this is in response to what you said earlier, because sometimes language changes, right? A certain Vedic form may not be the same form in classical Sanskrit. And I discuss how it is perhaps for this reason that there might have been an interpolation of one rule to derive a certain form, which Panini may never be trying to derive in the first place. So those kinds of exceptions exist. A couple of other patterns have been brought to my notice by certain scholars, and I'm going to write a rebuttal explaining why they're wrong actually. So and it's really important to have such a dialogue, because I mean, frankly, because it helps me. It helps me refine what I'm saying, but it also helps me show that in fact this is a much better method of doing things. But now to go back to your question of Param. Well, I was in two minds about whether I should do a PowerPoint presentation. It would have been a lot easier to go over that. We'll still do it anyway, but I decided not to do a PPT, because what happens is I end up getting lost in reading the text from the document, and I don't really end up talking to the audience. So we decided against doing that. I would have to write it down, unfortunately, or I would at least need a slide, a PPT slide to.
When you say, the right side,
Hmm.
this is your interpretation.
Hmm.
Now, the right side of a word,
No, so we're all so remember, we're always talking about within a word here,
yes,
right?
yes.
So the right hand side sound of a word. It could be two sounds within the same suffix, which is a part of the word, where one is left hand side, one is right hand side. It could be two different sounds within the root of the word.
Why don't
Yeah, so for example, when you're trying to derive the instrumental plural of mantra, mantraihi, you start with mantra, and Panini's instrumental plural affix is bhis. So you start with mantra plus bhis. One rule is applicable to the final of mantra. The other rule is applicable to the entire suffix bhis. That's an example.
What is the suffix? Yeah. Ra?
Bhis.
Okay.
Base. Yeah. And the right hand side rule, if you choose the right hand side rule, you get the correct answer. But the right hand side rule actually happens to be the rule that comes earlier in the serial order. So using the traditional method, you get the wrong answer. But then what the tradition does is it says this rule is Niravakasha. So there's no scope to apply this anywhere else, hence we must apply it here. But I mean, that is very clever sleight of hand, but once you scratch the surface, you realize it's not very productive to use that tool. If you actually want to use it in a sincere way, you can either trust the commentators or you actually try to do it yourself. And I would go with the latter option. So that's one example. But I mean, I invite you to read my thesis. There are many such examples, I promise, in it.
Perhaps you have an abstract of your thesis somewhere.
I would have liked to compress everything into a page, but there is an abstract in Sanskrit, a very good Sanskrit abstract written by a traditional scholar actually. It's on the mailing lists, and I have a copy. I'm happy to share it with you. He writes a very good Sanskrit abstract. The English abstract to my thesis is in my thesis on this page, on page 7 or something. So it's a one-page abstract. Yeah.
Have that. You will understand that. He's one of the pages.
Yeah.
Can I add something?
Please.
No, I would like to, this is one question that I have for him, but you gave me the chance to enter into the conversation because he says, I think his thesis can be verified, in an objective way, which cannot be said of many things. I don't know if you will agree with me, but how to verify if his method of interpretation is better than the one that we've been handed. It's simply, you run all the prakriyas. Prakriya, in Sanskrit grammar, as he said, Sanskrit grammar, he says, like a machine. Scholars like George Cardona, they say that the Sanskrit, the Panini, just for you to understand, is like a grammatical device. It's not a grammar like anything you have seen. That means to say, you suppose you ask a question to the grammar. Say, what will be the instrumental plural of mantras? Okay, which is mantraihi or mantrair. And then the Paninian grammar, will be like a computer, or like a code. Computer is our brain. The hardware is our own brain. Panini is the software. And then once you put the question, the grammar is supposed to start automatically, invoking one rule, having one result, and from that result, invoking another rule, etc. Let me finish. So the whole problem is that, so it's automatic. It's like a machine. It's supposed to be, that you will get the final derivation. And when you study Panini in an Indian university, I did that, he did that, you are supposed to begin and start applying all the rules till you have the desired result, right?
Let's say correct.
Or the correct design. Ishtan, I was translating, okay?
Can I just intervene here to say that?
Let me finish on
Yes,
it.
okay.
Let me finish and then, so the problem is that this is supposed to be an automatic process. Rules are invoking each other according to conditions and according to interpretations. So what I mean to say, if Rishi's method or interpretation is right, it can be tested. It will take a long time, It can be tested because you can get all the forms, Sanskrit forms, and start applying and see how the traditional prakriyas or methods of derivation work and how his new method work. I don't know if I am right, but you tell Rishi.
Let me add that I think Oscar should get a Nobel Prize if he managed to get the traditional system taught to the computer, let alone verified. Because the problem is, if you have Purva Vipratisiddha, how is it ethical to teach a system that in these cases do this, and then this doesn't work for so many cases, so we do Purva Pratishedha for all those cases. Because if we are permitting that, then why are we even bothering teaching it? So, but he's not wrong about the fact that my method should certainly be taught at the computer, and this test ought to be done. We should do it most certainly. As he said, it's a difficult task because we have to teach the whole Aṣṭādhyāyī to the computer, which is not easy. But we are one step closer, as I've said in the past, and that's true. But I would have loved for a comparison to be possible, but it's not, is what I would add. A comparison is not possible simply because with a tradition you can add as much as you like, as they have done over the last 2,500 years. And, how are you going to teach Nagesh's paribhashas to the computer? And so many of them are anitya paribhashas. Let me tell you all what anitya is. Anitya is sometimes these metals work, sometimes they don't work. So then, what do we tell the computer? You use your discretion, right? So it's not easy to actually strike a comparison. I would have loved for it to be easy, because then I could have said, oh, mine is clearly better. But I think I just wanted to add that to what you said. Yeah.
Wanted to ask you whether you were aware that in fact people have put Paninian grammar on the computer. IIT
Have they taught the whole Aṣṭādhyāyī to the computer?
No, I don't think so, and I really don't have the details.
Yeah. So please
But,
bring the details to me. Yeah.
Perhaps you. I won't bring the details to you. I think they are generally available. But if you care to explore this, the IIT Kanpur Computer Science Department did start such a project and has in fact made a certain amount of progress in this. Since I'm not a computer scientist, I have not followed that either.
Yeah, I know those people. Of course, I know those people.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, I do. Yeah.
That seems like a very laden kind of statement. If you know these people or you know their work.
Well,
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because we're not here to talk about people. It was simply that this experiment has already been performed. You have not referred to it. That's all right.
no, the idea is to teach the whole system to the computer and let the computer do all the work
Yes.
without any manual interference, which is what's been going on so far.
Yes, well,
Yeah.
it's the beginning.
Yeah.
Two more. The lady over there.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful presentation. So, your view is against a traditional view. It is as opposed to the traditional view. So, how has been the reception in the academic circle, as well as the people who have been practicing Sanskrit?
Gosh, there's been a wide variety of responses, from praise to opposition, as you can imagine. So I'll let you explore it on the internet.
Sure, thanks.
There, the lady.
Hi, Rishi. I've been following the discussion on Indology, and I noticed that there was a point up to which you responded to questions and criticisms, and then I think maybe you decided to stop. So I was just wondering if you were possibly collecting all of the objections, as it were, and that you will publish something, an addendum or a revision of your main thesis, or point by point refutation, because people have brought up. I mean, I'm not I'm not a Vyakarana person, but clearly it seems like there are examples to counter the examples that you've put forward. And I mean, I think the question of whether what computers are doing in this is completely irrelevant. That's not the point of what you're trying to show. You're trying to show a certain. You're trying to sort of, I think, how should I put it? Just clarify a little glitch, a bug what is apparently a bug in the system, or you found a way to think about a rule that will, debug it. And I think that's in itself a, worthy, scholarly and sort of systemic approach. And it is within the parampara, in the sense that that's what the parampara does. It's like constantly trying to refine our understanding and our ability to use this text as a way to look at the actual language and how it works, and to account for all of the variation that is possible, not necessarily that exists, but that is possible to explain. um, so I think, you may want to sort of assemble everything and come up with a kind of, a siddhanta eventually.
So what I've decided to do is, because of the sheer volume of such messages I receive on groups and individually, I think the best thing to do is where there are technical rebuttals of a technical nature. I think those are the ones that really merit a response, because of course there's going to be lots of rhetoric and lots of generic writing of things and proclamations and tall statements, many of which I've realized come from a position of absolutely no familiarity with my work. So it's not very productive to engage with those. But where technical things have been said, I will write responses, mostly PDFs, which I will circulate. I have a technical skeleton ready, but because those technical responses come with a certain amount of rhetorical flesh, I want to add that on. Respond appropriately to those. So I am planning to do that in the next couple of months. But as you can imagine, I work in Scotland, and I'm here for work also in India for only for a couple of months. So give me some time. Yeah, but and also in response to your other point, it's a often the smallest bugs create the biggest problems. So I will just add I'll just add to what you said, but I do agree with you that a dialogue is not only helpful but essential. Yeah, and that will happen. I think it's best if it happens on technical issues, because some of these emails and messages I have read, uh, it's not very productive to engage with in a very broad rhetorical way. They don't go anywhere, and they might often create just bitterness, and we don't want to do that. We just want to keep it technical. And frankly, I'm very grateful to some of the scholars. I don't put one person's name here, but I have a couple of those documents, and I've read them, and I've already, as I said, I have a skeleton of the response. I'm grateful to them, and I will mention this because they're only helping me. So that's great, and that will happen. So thank you for that. Yeah.
One question more, last question.
When we have that.
Who has written the Sanskrit abstract you mentioned?
The Sanskrit abstract, I don't know if he wants to be in the spotlight, but is by this scholar called Professor Tilak Rao, who is a traditionally trained scholar. He teaches at Chanakya University in Bangalore. So you can access his very well written abstract. And in fact, I can say in response to the lady with the green scarf. Sorry, I don't know your name, ma'am. No. Yeah, Kiran. So um, and it's really refreshing when you engage with traditional scholars, because I come from an English medium school background. Some scholars have been less responsive and not willing to engage as much. But for example, Professor Tilak Rao, when I did speak with him, uh, it was a very fruitful engagement, because he taught me how to frame certain things, actually, in a way that they're accessible to traditional scholars. And he did the noble work of translating it into Sanskrit, so that those scholars who might not have time or interest in reading the whole thesis, who might find it difficult to read it in English, right, because language is a barrier, can access it in Sanskrit and then see if they want to engage with it. So it's very heartening to see such responses, because this shows us that the tradition is producing scholars who are intellectually rigorous, willing to engage, and if you meet the man, or if you, there are a couple other scholars, I don't want to go into talking about all of them, but when you meet them, you will not think that they disrespect any of these scholars by agreeing with me, or that they disrespect modern scholarship or Katyayana or anyone. So it's really refreshing, the intellectual maturity which some of them show, and the insights that they bring to the table are very useful. Yeah.
We should be very brief.
Anyway, just let me ask, why do you think Katyayana, because you said he had both the interpretations, why do you think he chose the, according to you, it is not the wrong interpretation, or is there anything, because you are much closer, not such a thing, there must have been a tradition of scholarship from Panini himself, students and others, which, okay, oral continuity of this. So why do you think that such a wrong step would be taken?
Well, I won't call it a wrong step. But he chose one of the two interpretations. There might, you see, when you read Katyayana, what you observe is that this is a scholar who is rigorous, who is dedicated, who is curious, but who does not have all the answers. So there might have been some parts of the framework which were not exposed to him in a way that is explicitly clear that was explicitly clear to him. That said, the other possibility, why does it exist in the first place? Why was it not obvious that if para means something everywhere else, it means para here as well? It means right hand side here as well. Actually, there is a sutra in the there's a sutra in the Aṣṭādhyāyī, 8-1 Purvatra Siddham. There actually Panini uses the term Purvatra. Purva is the antonym of para. Purva means that which comes before, as opposed to para, which means that which comes after. There, Purvatra is meant to teach us with respect to the rule that comes before. So the position of the rule that comes later with respect. So that's the relationship between rules. I think it is from there that, because 142 also deals with relationships between rules, I think it is from there that this mistake was made. But if you look closely, Panini always uses tra when he wants to talk about the relationship of one rule with respect to another rule. So he says, Asiddhavad atra abhat, Asiddhavad atra abhat. Until this particular rule, what is here is asiddhavat with respect to what is taught in this section. So, so two rules are asiddhavat with respect to each other, essentially. Purvatra, what comes before is asiddha with respect, what comes after is asiddha with respect to what is before. So that, and I have discussed this in my thesis, that may have led to the confusion in the first place. But I think because it's been 2,500 years, we might make a big deal out of it. But we all have been down these paths where we realize much later first that we made these mistakes, and we try to rectify them, and life goes on. So but it is so great that he had those two registered. Perhaps he came up with a second possibility on his own. Perhaps someone mentioned it to him. But I have not had a chat with him, so I can't tell.
Thanks very much. We must be finishing here now. I think it's a very technical and interesting, and I would like to conclude only with saying that I myself benefit from this session. I understood better what he's trying to do, and I think it was very relevant when he said that in fact he's following the tradition by adding, and what would you say, that you are in the line of really putting new arguments, and new ways of interpretation. I will just say that, please, we should continue this at home, reading his thesis, because it is in the public domain. And there I think you will find many answers that in this short span of time couldn't be answered here. So please download his thesis and have a good look at it. And let's meet again one day after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.